Welcome to the Drowsy Economist. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. This is a space where we explore the structures that shape our economic world, not with urgency or alarm, but with the kind of quiet, unhurried attention that invites your mind to settle. Tonight we'll be moving through the history of the Great Depression, slowly, gently, from the very beginning. Before the imbalances, before the uncertainty, before the long and gradual years of adjustment, all the way through to the slow return of ordinary economic life. There's nothing here that needs to be memorized. No test at the end. If you find yourself learning something along the way, that's wonderful. If instead you find yourself drifting off into peaceful sleep, that's equally wonderful. There is no wrong way to experience this. And now, let us begin. There is a city street somewhere in America in the late 1920s. It is not a remarkable street. It is the kind of street that exists in most mid-sized cities, a wide avenue with buildings on both sides, some of them brick, some of them stone, a few of them faced with something smoother and more modern looking. There are storefronts at the ground level, a hardware store with tools arranged in its window, a pharmacy with a striped awning, a clothing shop where a mannequin stands behind the glass in something that was fashionable that season. Above the storefronts, there are offices, insurance companies, law firms, real estate agencies, and above those, on the upper floors, there might be apartments, or storage rooms, or nothing much in particular. In the morning, the street fills slowly. A delivery truck stops in front of the grocery. A man in a hat walks quickly toward the office building on the corner. A woman pauses at a shop window, then moves on. The streetcar runs on its tracks down the center of the avenue, stopping at regular intervals to let people on and off, the bell ringing once as it moves away from each stop. The rhythm of the street is regular. It has been regular for years. Shops open at roughly the same time each morning. They close at roughly the same time each evening. In between, a steady stream of ordinary commerce takes place. Things are purchased, things are ordered, things are delivered. Money changes hands in small amounts across glass counters, and receipts are written out by hand and folded into paper bags alongside whatever has been sold. This is what economic life looks like most of the time. It looks like a street. It looks like the hardware store owner unlocking his front door at 8 in the morning and flipping the sign from closed to open. It looks like the woman at the pharmacy counter counting change back into a customer's palm. It looks like the delivery driver pulling boxes off the back of his truck and stacking them on a handcart, moving them through a propped open door without hurrying. None of these people are thinking about the economy. They are thinking about the immediate task in front of them. The boxes need to go inside. The change needs to be counted correctly. The door needs to be unlocked. And yet all of this, taken together, all of these small and unremarkable transactions happening simultaneously across thousands of streets in hundreds of cities, is an economy. Or rather, it is what an economy looks like when you stand on a single street and watch it for an hour on an ordinary morning. The late 1920s were, for most of the people who lived through them, ordinary in exactly this way. The street opened in the morning and closed in the evening. People went to work. Goods moved from one place to another. Wages were paid. Bills were settled. The machinery of daily commercial life operated with the kind of unremarkable regularity that only becomes noticeable in retrospect when it stops. It is worth spending some time here, on this ordinary street, before anything changes, because what the street represents, this steady, unremarkable functioning, is what the period before the disruption actually felt like for most of the people living in it. Not a golden age, not a moment of obvious and visible prosperity that everyone could see and name, just the ordinary texture of economic life, going on as it had gone on, with the same small routines and the same steady rhythms that had characterized it for years. Let us stay here a little longer. The grocer across the street from the hardware store has been in business for 14 years. He rents his space from a landlord who owns 4 buildings on this block. He buys his produce from a distributor who gets it from farms and wholesale markets. His wife works in the store on Saturday mornings. His oldest son helps after school on Thursdays. He keeps a ledger, a large brown book with a cloth spine, in which he records every purchase and every sale. At the end of each month, he adds up the columns and notes whether the number at the bottom is positive or negative. Most months, it is positive. Some months, it is barely positive. A few months over the years, it has been slightly negative, and he is drawn from a small savings account to cover the gap. But most months, he makes a modest and reliable profit, which is enough to pay the rent, pay his employees, and set a little aside. This is the texture of small business in the late 1920s. It is not dramatic. It is not spectacular. It is simply a person, keeping careful records, managing the distance between what comes in and what goes out, and navigating the small fluctuations that are a part of any commerce. A few blocks away there is a factory. It makes small metal parts, fittings and fasteners of various kinds that are used in the construction of automobiles and household appliances. The factory employs about 80 people. They work in 2 shifts. The morning shift arrives before 6 and works until 2 in the afternoon. The afternoon shift arrives before 2 and works until 10 at night. The machines run for most of those hours, producing a steady output of small metal pieces that are packed into wooden crates and shipped by rail to manufacturers in other cities. The factory owner has a contract with an automobile company that requires a certain quantity of parts each month. The contract is renewed each year. When it was first signed, the quantity was smaller. Over the years, as automobile production has increased, the quantity has grown, and the factory has added equipment and hired more workers to meet it. This expansion has happened gradually. A new machine acquired in 1 year. An additional 12 workers hired over the course of the next, so that it has not felt like dramatic growth from the inside. It has felt like the ordinary, incremental growth of a business that is doing its work reliably and finding that there is a little more work to do each year. The workers at the factory live within walking distance mostly. They live in the neighborhoods that grew up around the factory. Streets of 2-story houses with small front yards, a few apartment buildings, a couple of boarding houses for single men. They shop at the same grocery across from the hardware store. They ride the same streetcar. Their wages go into local banks, or sometimes into an envelope kept at the back of a drawer at home, and they spend those wages on rent and food and clothing and the occasional larger purchase, a piece of furniture, a radio, a winter coat for a child. The banks in this neighbourhood are small. There are two of them within easy walking distance of the factory. Each has a counter with teller windows, a manager's office in the back, and a vault that is visible through thick glass from the main floor. People come in to make deposits and withdrawals, to arrange money orders, to take out small loans. The relationship between the bank and its depositors is personal in the way that relationships tend to be personal in neighbourhoods where most people have lived for years. The teller knows the names of the regular customers. The manager knows which families are reliable and which ones have had difficulty in the past. The banks lend money to the grocer when he needs to purchase a large quantity of goods ahead of a seasonal rush. They lend money to the factory owner when he wants to acquire new equipment. They hold the savings of factory workers and shopkeepers and the families in the surrounding streets. And they use those deposits, the accumulated savings of all these ordinary people, to fund the loans that allow other ordinary people to build or expand or purchase. This is the basic architecture of a local banking system, and it is not complicated. Money comes in from people who are saving. Money goes out to people who are borrowing. The bank keeps enough on hand to meet the ordinary day-to-day requests of depositors, and it earns the difference between what it pays depositors for the use of their money and what it charges borrowers for the use of the bank's money. None of this is unusual. It is simply how it works. The railroad that passes through the edge of this city carries goods in both directions. Inbound freight includes raw materials, steel, timber, cotton, grain, that local factories and warehouses need. Outbound freight includes finished goods from those same factories, heading to markets in other cities and states. The railroad runs on a schedule. The freight cars move according to their own slower rhythm, loading and unloading at the rail yards, moving through switches and along branch lines, eventually arriving wherever they were heading and unloading their contents into warehouses and receiving docks. The rail yard employs its own workers, men who couple and decouple cars, who operate the switching equipment, who maintain the tracks and the mechanical systems. They earn wages that also enter the local economy, spent at the same grocery, deposited at the same banks, circulating through the same quiet neighbourhood streets. This is the ordinary interconnectedness of a functioning economy. Nothing in it is particularly fragile, or at least nothing appears to be. The pieces fit together in a way that has been working for years, and the working of it has produced a kind of inertia, a tendency to continue working because it has been working, because the routines are established and the relationships are in place, and the wheels are turning in their accustomed grooves. The afternoon light on this street comes in at a particular angle, in autumn, low and golden, arriving between the buildings in narrow bands that move across the sidewalk as the day progresses. The shops are still open. The hardware store owner is sorting through a delivery of paint cans, stacking them in a back room. The pharmacy is seeing a steady trickle of customers, people stopping in on their way home from their offices and shops picking up small things they need. The streetcar has been running all day. It will run for a few hours more before the evening quiet settles in. Somewhere on the block, a window is open. The sound of a radio comes through it, music, faint, the kind that fills a room without demanding much attention. The music is ordinary. The window is ordinary. The street below it is ordinary, and the economy that the street is part of is, in this moment, doing what ordinary economies do, turning steadily without urgency, generating the small and unremarkable transactions that add up, over time, to something much larger than any single one of them. The morning will come again tomorrow. The delivery truck will come. The sign will be flipped. The streetcar bell will ring once. For now, let us simply remain here, on this street, in this ordinary light. Elsewhere in the city, further from the factory and the grocer and the rail yard, there are other activities that are part of the same economy, but feel somewhat different in character. There is a brokerage office on the main commercial street, 3 floors up in a building with an elevator. The office is carpeted and quiet. There are desks where men in suits sit with papers and telephones. Along one wall, a board displays a changing set of numbers, prices that are updated regularly throughout the day as information comes in from the exchanges in New York and other financial centers. People come into the office sometimes, a businessman checking on an investment, a professional man in his 40s who has been setting aside a portion of his savings for several years and putting it into the market. They sit with one of the men at the desks and discuss things in low voices and eventually make a decision about whether to buy or sell something. The board on the wall shows numbers. The numbers change. That is essentially what the board does. It shows numbers, and then it shows different numbers, and the direction those numbers have been moving over the past several years has been, in general, upward. Across the country, this same activity is happening in hundreds of similar offices in hundreds of cities. The stock market, which by the late 1920s has expanded considerably in the number of people participating in it and in the amounts of money moving through it, has become a part of ordinary commercial life in a way that it had not been, to the same degree, in earlier decades. More people own shares of companies than did a generation before. More people follow the prices. More people talk about the market in the ordinary way that people talk about things that have become familiar and unremarkable. The expansion had happened gradually, the way most expansions happen, not in a single moment, but across years, each year bringing in a few more participants than the year before, each increment of growth building on the one that preceded it. The credit that was available to people who wanted to purchase shares had also expanded during this period. A person who wanted to buy shares but did not have the full purchase price available could, in many cases, borrow a portion of it from their brokerage firm. This arrangement was called buying on margin. The shares themselves served as collateral for the loan. The buyer paid for part of the shares with their own money and borrowed the rest, and as long as the shares held their value or increased in value, the arrangement worked smoothly. The interest on the borrowing was a cost, but if the shares rose in value by more than the interest cost, the buyer came out ahead by more in fact, than if they had purchased only as many shares as their own money would allow. This logic, that borrowing to purchase something that is rising in value can amplify a gain, is straightforward enough, and it was not a new idea in the 1920s. People had been borrowing to purchase things for as long as lending existed. What was somewhat particular about the late 1920s was the scale on which this was happening in the share markets, and the degree to which the expectation of continued rising prices had become, for many participants, a working assumption rather than a hope. This is how markets behave when conditions are favourable and confidence is growing. It is not mysterious. It is simply the ordinary behaviour of a system in which more people want to buy than want to sell, for reasons that seem, to each of them individually, quite reasonable. The factory owner on the side street is aware of this, in a general way. He does not follow the market closely. He has enough to think about with his contracts and his equipment and his workforce. But he knows people who do follow it, and the general impression he has received from conversations in the ordinary way of business is that things have been going well in that part of the world. He has a modest amount in the market himself, a few shares purchased some years ago, not a large sum, not something he thinks about very often. The grocer is less involved. He has his savings account at the local bank and his ledger and his monthly arithmetic, and the market is something he reads about in the newspaper occasionally without finding it particularly relevant to his daily situation. He is not opposed to the idea of investing. It simply has not been part of his way of managing his finances. His assessment in the mid to late 1920s is that conditions are generally favourable, credit is available, businesses are borrowing, the bank's loan portfolio has been growing, and the loans that have been made have, in most cases, been performing adequately. There are some areas of concern, some agricultural lending that has been under pressure for longer than he would like, but the overall picture is one of a bank doing reasonable business in a reasonable environment. This picture, reasonable business in a reasonable environment, is what the late 1920s felt like from the inside of most institutions, not uniformly and not without pockets of difficulty, but in aggregate. The system was functioning, the wheels were turning, the money was moving. The money was moving in more directions than it once had. It was moving into new industries, the automobile industry, which had grown enormously in the preceding decades and was still growing, the electrical utilities which were extending power to more homes and businesses, the new industries that had grown up around radio and other communications technologies. These industries were genuinely expanding. They were producing more, employing more, generating more revenue than they had 5 or 10 years before. The investment in their shares reflected something real about their growth. The connection between the growth of these industries and the level of share prices was not always precise or direct. Prices reflect expectations about the future as much as they reflect current conditions, and expectations in the late 1920s were, in general, favourable. People expected the growth to continue. They expected the new industries to keep expanding. They expected the economy, which had been doing reasonably well for several years, to continue doing reasonably well. These expectations were not irrational. They were based on what had actually been happening, but they were expectations, which means they were claims about the future, and claims about the future can be wrong. Prices for agricultural products, wheat, corn, cotton, hogs, cattle, had been lower for most of the 1920s than they had been in the years immediately following the First World War. During the war, European demand for American agricultural products had been very high, and American farmers had expanded their production to meet it. They had borrowed to buy more land and more equipment, and to bring more acres under cultivation. Then the war ended, European agriculture recovered, and the demand that had driven prices high during the war years declined. Prices fell. The farmers who had borrowed during the high price years found themselves carrying debt at levels that had made sense when prices were high, but were harder to manage when prices were lower. This had been the situation for most of a decade. Some farmers had managed, some had struggled, some had lost their farms through foreclosure when they could no longer make their loan payments. The rural banks in farming regions had been carrying a higher share of troubled loans than the banks in the industrial cities. A number of rural banks had failed quietly over the course of the decade, not in ways that made large national news, but in the ordinary way that small financial institutions sometimes fail when the communities they serve are under sustained economic pressure. This was happening, but it was happening at a distance from the ordinary city street we have been observing, from where the grocer stands, or the factory owner, or the bank manager in his urban branch. The agricultural difficulties were something read about in the newspaper. A paragraph here, a report there, something concerning in an abstract way, but not immediately relevant to the business of the street. This is how large systems contain their internal differences, not by resolving them, but simply by continuing. Each part going about its business, each part's participants focused on what is immediate and visible. The connections between the parts present, but not always apparent until some change makes them so. In the city, on the ordinary street, the afternoon is moving toward evening. The brokerage office is preparing to close. The man who monitors the ticker is winding down the last of the day's activity. The numbers on the board have settled into their closing positions. Whatever the day brought, a small rise, a small decline, something unremarkable either way, is now fixed in the record. Tomorrow the board will open again, and the numbers will begin moving again, and whatever the following day brings will be added to the long accumulating record of all the previous days. The grocer is locking his front door. The hardware store has already closed. The factory's afternoon shift is still running. The machines continue their work into the evening, producing the fittings and fasteners that the automobile manufacturer needs, packing them into wooden crates, loading those crates onto pallets for pickup in the morning. The city settles into its night. Everything, for the moment, is continuing as it has been continuing. The system is in motion. The money is moving, the credit is flowing, the factories are producing, the shops have sold what they have sold today and will open again tomorrow to sell more. Nothing from the outside looks like a thing that is about to change. And yet, quietly, in the parts of the system that are not visible from the ordinary street, the conditions are not quite the same as they appear. The year is moving through 1928 and into 1929, and the ordinary street is still ordinary. The delivery truck still comes in the morning. The grocer still adds up his columns at the end of each month and finds, most months, a modest positive number at the bottom. The factory still runs its 2 shifts. The rail yard still loads and unloads its freight cars on a schedule that has not changed in any meaningful way. The streetcar still runs. The bank still opens at 9 and closes at 3 and processes its deposits and withdrawals and loan applications in the quiet, methodical way that banks have always processed these things. And yet the conditions that surround all of this ordinary activity have been shifting, slowly and in ways that are not easily visible from the street. The Federal Reserve has been thinking for some time about what to do about the level of credit flowing into share purchases. The concern is not that share prices are too high or too low. That is not the kind of judgment a central bank is well positioned to make. The concern is simpler and more structural. A large amount of borrowed money has entered the share markets, and if share prices were to fall significantly, the people who had borrowed that money would find themselves in difficulty. They would need to sell shares to repay loans. The selling would push prices lower. Lower prices would require more selling. The interaction between falling prices and forced selling could, under certain conditions, become self-reinforcing. This concern has been discussed. Various approaches have been considered. Some officials have favoured raising interest rates, which would make borrowing more expensive and might slow the flow of credit into the markets. Others have been cautious about raising rates because higher rates would affect not only the speculative borrowing in the share markets, but also the ordinary borrowing of businesses and households, and the economy as a whole was, by most measures, functioning well. The discussions have continued, as discussions in large institutions tend to do, without producing a definitive resolution. By the spring and summer of 1929, the prices on the board in the brokerage office are at levels that represent a very large increase over where they were a few years earlier. The professional man who started putting a portion of his savings into the market several years ago has watched the value of those savings grow considerably. The businessman who checks the board in the afternoon has investments that are worth more than they were when he made them. People who have been participating in the market for several years have, in most cases, done well by it. And the doing well has reinforced the sense that participation is reasonable, and the general direction of prices is upward. New participants continue to enter. People who had been watching from a distance, observing the gains that others had made, decide that the time has come to participate. Some of them borrow to do so. The margin loans continue to accumulate. The collateral backing those loans, the shares themselves, continues to be valued at the prices that the market is currently assigning, which are high prices, which makes the collateral look adequate. There is something circular in this, though it is not always easy to see from inside it. The shares are used as collateral for loans. The loans purchase more shares. The purchasing of more shares supports the prices. The high prices make the collateral look adequate. The adequate collateral makes the loans look sound. The sound loans continue to be extended. And so the structure supports itself for as long as the prices hold. On the ordinary street, none of this internal logic is visible or discussed. The grocer is thinking about his produce order. The factory owner is thinking about his contract. The bank manager is processing loan applications. The streetcar runs on its tracks. The window on the second floor of the building across the street is open, and the faint sound of a radio comes through it, as it did last week and the week before. Let us look, for a moment, at the broader shape of the economy as it exists in the late 1920s, before anything begins to shift. Electrical power has been extended to a much larger portion of the population than had access to it a generation earlier. The appliances and devices that run on electrical power, Radios, refrigerators, washing machines, electric irons and fans and lights have moved from the category of luxuries available only to the wealthy into the category of things that a working family might reasonably aspire to own, and in many cases does own. The industries that manufacture these things have grown accordingly, and the utilities that supply the power to run them have grown as well. The construction industry has been active throughout the decade. New buildings have gone up in the cities, office buildings, apartment buildings, hotels, department stores. New houses have been built in the neighborhoods at the edges of cities, as people with automobiles have been able to live further from their workplaces than previous generations could. The building of all these structures has employed carpenters and bricklayers and electricians and plumbers and the workers who manufacture the materials those tradespeople use. But the growth has also produced debt. The households that purchased automobiles and appliances on installment plans, paying a small amount each month over a period of time rather than the full purchase price at once, carry that debt. The farmers who borrowed to expand their operations during the high price war years still carry the debt they took on then, even though the prices that justified the borrowing have long since retreated. The businesses that borrowed to expand their facilities carry debt. The individuals who borrowed to purchase shares carry debt. The total debt in the system, the sum of all the borrowing that has been done to fund all of this activity, has grown alongside the growth of the economy. This is normal. A growing economy generates more borrowing because there are more investments to make and more purchases to finance. The relationship between economic growth and the expansion of credit is a natural and expected one. In 1929, the income of most participants in the economy is still adequate to service their debts. The assets that back the debt, the houses, the equipment, the shares, still carry values that make the debt look manageable. The system is in balance. The equilibrium is real, even if some of its components have been stretched further than they might ideally be. The summer of 1929 has a particular quality to it that is worth noting. Not because anything visible is wrong, but because it is the last summer in which the ordinary street looks entirely as it has been looking. The hardware store owner has repainted his storefront. The awning on the pharmacy has been replaced. The old one had faded and one of its mounting brackets had come loose, and the new one is a somewhat brighter shade of the same colour, fresh and taut in the summer sun. The factory has been running steadily. A new piece of equipment was delivered in June, a press that the factory owner decided to purchase, after the favourable conversation with the bank manager earlier in the year. The loan is in place. The equipment is running. The additional capacity is being put to use. The brokerage office itself has been busier this year than in previous years. More clients, more transactions, more pages in the order books. The men at the desks have been working harder. The man who monitors the ticker has had days when the tape ran faster than he expected, days of high volume when the transactions came in quickly and the record of them accumulated faster than felt entirely comfortable. High volume is, in itself, neither alarming nor reassuring. Markets have busy days and quiet days, and the variation is ordinary. But the quality of attention in the office has changed slightly over the course of the summer, become a little more focused, a little more alert to the movements of the board. The numbers have been high High numbers, after a long period of rising, attract a particular kind of attention. Not alarm, exactly, but a watchfulness that was not necessary when the numbers were lower and the direction was simply and unambiguously upward. September is a month of resumption. Schools open, offices fill back up after the relative quiet of August. The pace of commercial activity, which sometimes softens slightly in the hottest weeks of summer, picks back up in September. The brokerage office sees its clients returning from their summer routines. The board shows prices that are, as of September, still at high levels. The number of people who have something at stake in the direction of those prices is larger than it has been at any previous point. The month passes in the ordinary way that months pass. Days accumulate. The streetcar runs. The grocer orders his produce. The bank processes its transactions. The factory ships its crates. And October arrives, as October always does, carrying with it the particular quality of a month in which the year begins, quietly, to prepare for its ending. The board in the brokerage office shows prices in October that are, at the beginning of the month, still at levels recognizable from September. The men at the desk are working their ordinary October hours. The ticker runs. The clients come and go. The orders are placed and executed and recorded in the order books, in the same way they have always been placed and executed and recorded. But during the second and third weeks of October, something in the movement of the prices begins to feel different from what the preceding months established as normal. It is not a single day. It is not a single event. It is a quality of movement, the way the numbers drift through the course of a session, the direction they tend to settle by the close, the way recoveries from a morning decline do not quite carry prices back to where they opened. Someone watching the board very carefully over the course of several consecutive days would notice that the recoveries are not recovering all the way, that the general tendency of the numbers across days and then across a week is to end the session slightly lower than it began. The people watching the board have seen this kind of movement before. There have been dips in the preceding years, periods of several days or a week or two in which prices moved lower before resuming their general upward direction. Each of those dips had been followed by a recovery. The recoveries had been reliable enough that they had become, over time, part of the working assumption of most participants, that dips were temporary, that the general direction was upward, that patience in the face of a short-term decline was generally rewarded. The men at the desks in the brokerage office are answering more telephone calls than usual. Clients are calling to ask about the prices. The calls are not panicked. They are the ordinary inquiries of people who are paying closer attention than they usually do. People who are checking in on something they have a stake in and have noticed is moving in an uncomfortable direction. The answers the men at the desks give are careful and measured. They describe the movement as within the range of what markets do. They note that there have been dips before. They do not make specific predictions. By the third week of October, the volume of selling has increased. This is where the mechanism that had been building quietly over the preceding years begins to become visible. The people who had borrowed to purchase shares, who had bought on margin, putting up a portion of the purchase price themselves and borrowing the rest from their brokerage firms, are carrying loans that are secured by the value of the shares they hold. When the value of those shares falls, the collateral backing the loans becomes less adequate. The brokerage firm, whose loan is now less well secured than it was, sends a notice to the borrower, a margin call, requiring them to either deposit additional funds to restore the adequacy of the collateral or sell some shares to reduce the size of the loan to a level appropriate for the reduced collateral value. Each step in this sequence is individually logical. Each person receiving a margin call and selling shares is doing exactly what the terms of their loan require. Each brokerage firm sending a margin call is doing exactly what sound lending practice demands. The sequence as a whole, the interaction of all these individually rational decisions, produces a pattern of declining prices and increasing selling that no single participant intended, and that no single participant is in a position to stop. This is the basic mechanism of the market decline of late October 1929. It is not a mysterious process. It is the predictable consequence of a structure in which a very large amount of borrowed money has entered a market, secured by assets whose value depends on the continued confidence of buyers, at a moment when that confidence has begun, for whatever combination of reasons, to soften. The ticker in the brokerage office is running behind. On the busiest days, the volume of transactions is large enough that the machine cannot keep pace. The tape that emerges from it, the narrow strip of paper on which prices and volumes are printed, is recording prices that are minutes old by the time they are read. The delay grows on the busiest afternoons, so that a broker reading the tape at 2:30 is seeing prices from an hour earlier, prices from a market that has moved considerably since those numbers were printed. The closing prices on some days in the last week of October represent declines that are, in a single session, larger than anything the market has seen in many years. The numbers on the board at the end of those sessions are meaningfully lower than the numbers at the beginning. People who look at their brokerage statements and compare them to statements from a month earlier find a significant difference. And then, in the following days, there are partial recoveries. Prices rise somewhat from their lows. The men at the desks answer calls from clients who want to know if the worst is over. The answers remain careful. The recovery is noted. The recovery does not carry prices back to where they were at the beginning of October. Through November, the market continues to find lower levels. Not in a straight line downward, but in the irregular way that markets move, some days higher, some days lower. The overall direction when you step back and look at the whole month, rather than the individual days being clearly and unmistakably lower. The high levels of the summer, the prices that had seemed to confirm the general upward trend of the preceding years, are now some considerable distance above where the current prices stand. On the ordinary street, the impact of these events is arriving gradually and through several channels at once. The professional man who visited the brokerage office regularly and added to his holdings in the spring is now sitting with investments that are worth considerably less than he paid for them. He has not sold. He has, in fact, been thinking about whether to sell, and has decided for the moment to hold. This decision, to hold rather than sell, is one that many people in his position are making, and it is a decision that has a particular economic effect. It means that he is not going to make the purchases he had been thinking about making, the furniture he had been considering for the study, the automobile he had been planning to buy next year. Those decisions have been quietly set aside. not because he cannot afford them in any immediate sense, but because the decline in the value of his investments has produced a feeling of reduced certainty about his financial position, and that feeling of reduced certainty has translated, in the ordinary way, into a reduced willingness to commit to new expenditures. This is the first channel through which the market decline reaches the ordinary street, not through the loss of cash necessarily, but through the change in how people feel about their financial situation and, consequently, how willing they are to spend. He does not lay anyone off immediately. The current contract is still running, and the workers are needed to fill it. But the plan to expand has been suspended. The loan conversation with the bank manager, the discussion about borrowing to hire and grow, has been quietly shelved for now. The bank manager has noticed over the course of November and December that the pipeline of new loan applications has thinned. Businesses that had been discussing expansion plans have become quieter. A few conversations that seemed to be moving toward loan agreements have simply stopped, without any formal conclusion, as if the parties involved decided to wait before committing to anything new. The manager makes a note of this in his own private assessment of conditions. The note says, in the careful language of a cautious person, that the environment has become somewhat less certain, and that applications may continue at a reduced pace for some time. Some of the bank's existing borrowers have also been in touch, not in large numbers and not with any urgency, but a few of them have called or come in to discuss their situations. A businessman whose holdings have declined in value is carrying a loan secured partly by those holdings, and the decline in value has changed the arithmetic of his loan. The manager is working through these situations one at a time, in the patient and procedural way that banks work through loan situations. There is no general alarm. There is simply more careful attention being paid to the existing portfolio than was necessary 6 months ago. The grocer's December receipts are, when he adds up the columns on the last evening of the month, slightly lower than his December receipts from the year before. Not dramatically lower, but lower. He sets his pencil down and looks at the number for a moment. December is usually one of his stronger months. He turns the page to the blank January section and prepares to begin recording the new year. The new year is 1930. It arrives without announcement. The date changes. The routines continue. The street opens in the morning and closes in the evening. The system is still functioning, but the conditions within it are not what they were a year ago, and the process of adjustment that began in October has not finished working its way through the connected parts of the economy. It is, in the way of large and slow-moving things, just beginning. The early months of 1930 have a particular quality that is different from the early months of the years that preceded them, though the difference is not easy to name precisely from the inside of it. The street still looks largely the same. The shops are open, the factory is running, the bank is processing its transactions. The streetcar moves along its tracks in the cold morning air. But something in the quality of activity has changed. A slight reduction in pace, a slight increase in caution. The way that people and institutions move when they are not certain about what the next months will bring and have decided, without any formal announcement or deliberate coordination, to wait and see before committing to new things. This waiting, This collective pause in the forward motion of spending and borrowing and expanding is itself an economic event. It is not a dramatic one. It does not announce itself. But when many people and many businesses simultaneously decide to be a little more careful, a little more conservative, a little less willing to take on new obligations, the effect of all those individual decisions accumulates into something measurable. Less is spent, less is ordered, less is produced. Fewer people are needed to produce it. Those workers live in the neighborhood. They shop at the grocer. They ride the streetcar. They have accounts at the bank. The reduction in their wages, or the elimination of their wages in the case of those who have been let go entirely, is a reduction in the money flowing through those other parts of the neighborhood economy. The grocer feels it in a small way because the households of those workers are buying somewhat less. The streetcar feels it in a small way because a person who is not going to work is not paying the fare. The bank feels it in a small way because the deposits from those workers are no longer arriving on the schedule they once did. None of these individual reductions is large enough to be noticed in isolation, but they are happening alongside similar small reductions in other factories, in other neighborhoods, in other cities. And the accumulation of all those small reductions, each one modest, each one the consequence of some individual decision made for entirely reasonable local reasons, adds up across the whole of the economy to a measurable decline in the total level of activity. In 1930, nothing has yet changed those conditions in any fundamental way. The banking system is experiencing its own version of the adjustment. Banks are institutions whose stability depends, as we noted earlier, on the continued confidence of their depositors. As long as depositors believe that their money is safe and will be returned to them when they ask for it, they have no reason to ask for it all at once. And as long as they are not asking for it all at once, the bank can maintain its ordinary operations, holding a fraction of its deposits in reserve and lending the rest, earning the interest that makes the institution viable. The word that a bank has failed travels quickly through the community it serves. It travels through the ordinary channels of neighborhood communication, people talking to each other, word passing from household to household, the news arriving at the breakfast table or over the back fence or in the line at the grocery. And when people in that community hear that the bank has failed, some of them, the ones who have money in other banks, the ones who had previously felt no particular concern about the safety of their deposits, begin to wonder. If that bank failed, they wonder, could my bank also fail? The wondering is reasonable. It is not irrational. It is the ordinary process of updating one's assessment of risk based on new information. The new information that banks can fail, that deposits can be lost, is true, and it is relevant, and incorporating it into one's thinking is exactly what a careful person would do. The problem is that when enough careful people incorporate this information simultaneously and act on it by withdrawing their deposits, they create precisely the conditions that make additional bank failures more likely, which provides further information to further careful people who withdraw further deposits. Through 1930, a significant number of banks across the country, concentrated in the agricultural regions but not confined to them, closed or were reorganized. Each closing affected the depositors of that bank directly. It also affected the businesses that relied on that bank for credit. A small business that had been borrowing from a bank that closed suddenly found itself without its usual source of operating funds. Without those funds, it might be unable to meet payroll, or unable to purchase supplies, or unable to bridge the ordinary gap between the time when expenses were incurred and the time when revenues arrived. Some of those businesses reduced their operations. Some closed entirely. The banks that were still operating watched these events and drew their own conclusions. The conclusions they drew, that conditions were uncertain, that the risk of lending was higher than it had been, that maintaining larger reserves than usual was prudent given what was happening elsewhere in the system, led them to reduce their own lending activity. Not because they were required to, but because the environment had made caution seem wiser than it had seemed a year earlier. The grocer, who has been watching his monthly receipts with more attention than usual, has made some adjustments of his own. He has reduced the size of his standing orders from the produce distributor. There is no advantage to ordering goods that will not be sold, and the risk of waste has become more significant now that the margins are thinner. He has been slower to reorder items that are moving slowly. He has extended a little less credit to the handful of regular customers who have always had informal arrangements to pay at the end of the month, because the end-of-month payments have become slightly less reliable than they once were. None of this is a crisis for him. He is a careful man who has managed his business through ordinary fluctuations for 14 years, and he is applying that same carefulness to a period of somewhat more pronounced fluctuation. But the adjustments he is making, smaller orders, tighter credit to customers, are adjustments that ripple back through the system. The distributor from whom he orders less receives a smaller order. The farmers whose produce the distributor handles sell a little less. The adjustments accumulate. The employment office on the main street has seen a steady increase in the number of people coming through its door. The men who staff it are processing applications, making referrals, maintaining the lists. The lists are longer than they were a year ago. The referrals are producing fewer successful placements because the businesses that would receive those referrals are hiring less than they used to. The employment office is doing its work, but the work has become harder because the gap between the people looking for work and the positions available to fill has widened. The city government, which funds the employment office and a range of other services, is noticing the effects of reduced economic activity on its own revenues. Property taxes are harder to collect from owners who are behind on their payments. The revenue from various fees and levies is lower because the activity those fees are applied to has declined. The city is managing its budget with the same kind of increased care that the grocer and the factory owner and the bank manager are applying to their own situations, looking for places to reduce expenditure, deferring things that can be deferred, maintaining the essential services as best it can with the resources available. And yet the street endures. The buildings are still standing. The streetcar still runs, though with fewer passengers. The bank is still open, though its operations are more cautious. The hardware store is still there, its signs still flip to open in the morning and back to closed in the evening. The owner still sorting through his inventory and filling the occasional order and keeping his own careful records. The endurance of the ordinary is one of the less remarked features of difficult economic periods. Systems do not simply stop. They slow and they contract, and they adjust in 100 quiet ways to conditions that have changed. But the basic infrastructure of commercial life, the buildings and the streets and the institutions and the habits of daily exchange, persists through the adjustment, carrying within it the capacity for resumption when conditions change again. The process by which they will change is slow and will take several more years to work through. It will involve responses from institutions and governments that have been watching the developing situation and gradually forming views about what can and should be done. Those responses are still being assembled, still being debated, still making their way through the slow machinery of institutional decision-making. For now, on the ordinary streets in the winter of 1930 and into 1931, the adjustment continues, quietly and without drama, and at the pace of large things that move only when enough of their constituent parts have moved first. The streetcar bell rings once at the stop on the corner. 2 people get off. The doors close. The car moves on into the cold grey morning, carrying the small number of passengers who have somewhere to go and the fare to get there, moving along its tracks with the patient reliability of something that does not know whether times are good or difficult, but simply runs, as it was built to run, from one end of the line to the other and back again. The city we have been observing is one city. It has its factory and its grocer and its bank and its brokerage office and its streetcar running on its tracks through the cold morning air. It has its neighbourhood streets and its rail yard and its employment office with its lengthening lists. It is a particular place with particular characteristics, and the adjustments it has been making through 1930 and into 1931 are the adjustments of that particular place responding to conditions that have changed around it. But the city is not alone in this. Across the country, in other cities and in other kinds of places entirely, in the small towns that exist between cities, in the farming communities that spread across the interior of the continent, in the mill towns of the southeast and the mining communities of the mountain states and the port cities along both coasts, the same process of adjustment is underway. Not identically, because no 2 places are identical, and the depression did not arrive everywhere at the same moment or with the same intensity. But the direction of movement is the same in most places. Less activity, less credit, fewer people with wages, more careful management of reduced resources. When the overall economy slows and incomes decline across the country, the demand for agricultural products adjusts along with everything else. People with less money to spend make different choices about what they purchase and how much of it. The prices that farmers receive for what they grow reflect, in part, the level of demand in the broader economy, and the broader economy's demand has been declining. So the prices that were already low have, in some cases, declined further, pressing farmers who were already stretched into situations that are very difficult to manage. The banks in farming communities, the small rural banks that had been carrying troubled agricultural loans through most of the 1920s, are now under more severe pressure than they have been at any previous point. Some of them have been failing at a rate that is impossible to ignore. When a bank in a small farming town fails, it is not just the depositors who are affected, though they are affected significantly and immediately. The whole financial infrastructure of that community is disrupted. The farmer who relied on that bank for his seasonal operating loan, the loan that allowed him to purchase seed and fuel and supplies at the beginning of the growing season to be repaid when the harvest came in, can no longer obtain that loan. Without it, the planting is constrained. Without adequate planting, the harvest is smaller. A smaller harvest produces less revenue. Less revenue makes it harder to service the remaining debt. The towns that exist to serve the farming communities, the small commercial centres where farmers purchase supplies and equipment and sell their products, feel the reduction in farm income directly. The implement dealer who sells tractors and ploughs and other agricultural equipment sees his sales decline sharply because farmers who are struggling to make their existing loan payments are not purchasing new equipment. The general store that serves the rural community sees its receipts fall. The small bank in the town is watching its loan portfolio with increasing concern. In the industrial cities of the Northeast and Midwest, the factories that produce the goods that the country buys, the automobiles and appliances and clothing and furniture, and the 1,000 other manufactured items that constitute the output of an industrial economy, are producing less than they were. They are producing less because the orders for their products have declined. The orders have declined because the people and businesses that would normally place those orders have less money to spend or less confidence in spending what they have, or both. The reduction in factory output means fewer workers are needed. Fewer workers employed means fewer wages circulating through the neighborhoods where those workers live. Fewer wages circulating means less spent at the local shops, which means those shops order less from their suppliers, which means those suppliers need less from the factories that produce what the suppliers distribute. The circle completes itself and then begins again, each rotation carrying slightly less activity than the one before. The institutions that provide relief, the charities, the mutual aid societies, the local government welfare offices, are experiencing something that has a particular quality to it. The demand for their services is growing at exactly the moment when the resources available to fund those services are shrinking. The donations that support charities come from people and businesses whose own incomes have declined. The tax revenues that fund local government services have fallen, along with the economic activity they are derived from. The gap between what is needed and what is available is widening in most communities, and it is widening steadily rather than all at once. This is one of the structural difficulties of a broad economic contraction. The mechanisms that exist to cushion its effects, private charity, local government assistance, community organizations, are themselves part of the same economic system that is contracting. They do not exist outside the system, drawing on some independent source of resources. They depend on the same incomes and the same tax base and the same financial conditions as everything else. And when those conditions deteriorate, the cushioning mechanisms deteriorate along with them. European economies, particularly Germany, which had been borrowing heavily from American lenders through the 1920s to manage its post-war obligations and to finance its own economic recovery, found those American loans being called back or not renewed as American lenders became more cautious. German banks, which had been relying on a continuing flow of American credit, found themselves under pressure when that flow slowed. Some German banks encountered serious difficulties in 1931. The difficulties in German banking transmitted to other European banking systems through the connections between them. Governments in various countries, observing the declining trade, had in some cases responded by raising tariffs, taxes on imported goods, with the intention of protecting their domestic industries from foreign competition. The United States had done this with legislation passed in 1930. The effect of tariffs raised simultaneously by multiple trading partners is to reduce the overall volume of trade between them, since each country's exports face higher barriers in the markets where they are sold. The reduction in trade added a further layer of contraction to an already contracting global economy. Back on the ordinary street, 1931 has a quality of settled difficulty that is different from the uncertainty of 1930. In 1930, many people believed the situation was temporary, that the ordinary functioning of the economy would reassert itself in a matter of months, as it had after previous periods of reduced activity. By 1931, that belief has become harder to sustain. The months have passed and the recovery that was expected has not arrived. The difficulty has deepened rather than resolved. People are adjusting their expectations as well as their budgets, and the adjustment of expectations, the revision of the working assumption from temporary difficulty to something of uncertain duration, has its own effect on behavior. The grocer is operating a smaller business than he ran 2 years ago. Not dramatically smaller. The door is still open, the shelves are still stocked, the regular customers still come, but measurably smaller. He has let one of his part-time employees go. He has reduced the variety of items he carries. He has renegotiated the terms of his lease with the landlord, who has his own reasons to prefer a lower but reliable rent over the risk of the space sitting empty. The adjustment is complete enough that it no longer feels like adjustment. It feels like the current condition. The factory owner is running his reduced operation with the same methodical attention he brought to the larger operation of a few years ago. One shift. A smaller workforce. A contract that is a fraction of what it was at its peak. He is servicing his loan from the equipment purchase, the press he acquired in the summer of 1929. And the payments on that loan are a larger share of his reduced revenue than they were when the revenue was higher. He is managing this, but managing it requires attention and careful arithmetic every month in a way that was not previously necessary. The brokerage office has reduced its staff. 2 of the men who sat at the desks are no longer there. The board still shows prices, but the prices it shows are, for most of the securities listed, a fraction of what they were in the summer of 1929. The clients who come in are fewer. Some have lost enough on their investments that they no longer have anything to invest. Some have simply stopped coming in, not because they have sold everything, but because looking at the board is no longer something they want to do on a regular basis. The city, at the end of 1931, is a quieter place than it was at the end of 1928. The buildings are the same buildings. The streets follow the same routes. The basic geography of commercial life is unchanged. But the activity within that geography, the number of transactions, the volume of goods moving, the number of people with wages and the amount of those wages is substantially reduced from what it was 3 years earlier, and the process of reduction is not yet finished. But the changes that are coming are, in fact, coming. slowly through the machinery of political and institutional decision-making, through the long process by which societies with democratic governments arrive at new approaches to new problems, the responses are being assembled. They will not arrive all at once. They will not resolve everything immediately. But they are in motion, in the way that large institutional responses are always in motion, gradually, incrementally, with the particular slowness of things that must pass through many hands and many deliberations before they become real. The winter deepens. The street is quiet in the evenings. The lights in the shops go out earlier than they used to. The streetcar makes its last run and returns to the depot. The city settles into the long, cold dark of a difficult season, carrying within it, as cities always do, the capacity to be something different when the conditions allow. The federal government in Washington is a large and slow-moving institution, as large institutions tend to be. It has departments and bureaus and agencies, each with its own staff and its own procedures and its own established ways of doing things. It has a Congress that must debate and vote on legislation before it becomes law. It has an executive branch that must implement whatever the Congress passes, translating the language of legislation into the actual operations of government programs. It has a judicial branch that interprets what the legislation means and whether it falls within the boundaries of what the Constitution permits. All of this takes time. The machinery of democratic government is not designed for speed. It is designed for deliberation, for the slow and often contentious process of arriving at decisions that enough people can accept, through enough rounds of argument and revision, that the decisions can actually be carried out. This is not a criticism of the design. It is simply a description of how it works, and how it worked in the early 1930s as the government was attempting to formulate a response to conditions that were, by most measures, more severe than anything it had previously been asked to address. The Hoover administration, which was in office from 1929 through early 1933, was not inactive in the face of the contraction. It took a number of steps that were within the framework of economic thinking that prevailed at the time, reasonable responses to the developing situation. It encouraged businesses to maintain wages rather than cutting them, on the theory that maintaining wages would maintain purchasing power and prevent a downward spiral of spending. It supported some expansion of public works spending. It created new institutions designed to provide credit to banks and businesses that were under pressure. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation began lending in 1932. It lent to banks and to other institutions. Some of the lending was effective in stabilizing institutions that might otherwise have failed. But the scale of the difficulty it was addressing was large, and the amounts available to lend were limited relative to the overall need, and the conditions attached to the lending were sometimes restrictive enough that institutions that needed help were cautious about seeking it, because seeking it publicly might signal to depositors that the institution was in trouble, which might trigger the very withdrawals the lending was meant to prevent. This is one of the structural difficulties of providing emergency support to financial institutions during a period of widespread uncertainty. The support is most needed by the institutions that are most visibly distressed. But the act of visibly seeking support can itself become evidence of distress, which can make the situation worse rather than better. The institutions that most need the help are sometimes the least able to seek it openly. The period between the election in November and the inauguration in March, which in those years was still the date when new presidents took office, a gap of nearly 4 months, is itself a period of continued difficulty. The incoming administration and the outgoing administration are not in close coordination. Policy is in a state of suspension. And the banking system during these months experiences another acute wave of pressure. By the time Franklin Roosevelt was inaugurated on the 4th of March 1933, the banking system had reached a condition in which a significant number of states had already declared their own bank holidays, temporary closures of banks within their borders, in an attempt to halt the outflows and give the institutions time to stabilize. The system that was left standing on Inauguration Day was, in the dry language of financial assessment, severely impaired. Roosevelt's response in the first days of his administration was to declare a national bank holiday. The pause itself had a stabilizing effect in the way that pauses sometimes do. The outflow of deposits could not continue if the banks were closed. The immediate pressure was suspended, and during the days of the holiday, the administration and the Treasury Department and the bank examiners worked through the condition of individual banks, sorting them into categories: those that were sound enough to reopen immediately, those that needed some reorganization before reopening, and those that were too impaired to reopen at all. When banks began reopening, the sound ones first, then the reorganized ones over the following days and weeks, they did so in an environment that had changed in a specific and important way. The President had addressed the country directly, in the first of what would become a series of radio broadcasts, explaining in plain and calm language what had happened, what was being done, and why the banks that were reopening could be trusted. The explanation was simple. It did not use complicated financial language. It described the situation in terms that a person without any particular financial knowledge could follow. This was the bank holiday of March 1933. It is one of the cleaner examples in economic history of how a change in the conditions surrounding a system, in this case a change in the information available to depositors and in their confidence about the safety of their deposits, can shift the behavior of that system relatively quickly, even when the underlying financial condition of the institutions has not itself changed dramatically in the short term. The legislation that followed the bank holiday addressed the banking system more broadly. The Glass-Steagall Act, passed in June of 1933, made several changes to the structure of banking. One of the most consequential was the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The corporation provided insurance for bank deposits, a guarantee backed by the federal government that deposits up to a certain amount would be returned to depositors even if the bank holding them failed. This was a structural change of considerable importance. The dynamic that had been destabilizing banks throughout the contraction, the tendency of depositors to withdraw funds when they became uncertain about a bank's health, which then made the bank's health worse, which prompted further withdrawals, depended on the absence of any guarantee. If deposits were guaranteed, a depositor had no particular reason to rush to withdraw them at the first sign of uncertainty. The money would be there whether or not they withdrew it immediately. The incentive to run was removed. Other legislation addressed the securities markets. The Securities Act of 1933 required companies that were offering shares to the public to disclose detailed information about their finances and their operations. The Securities Exchange Act of 1934 created the Securities and Exchange Commission, a permanent federal agency with the authority to oversee trading in financial markets and to set standards for how that trading was conducted. The intent behind these measures was to address some of the conditions that had contributed to the speculative excesses of the late 1920s. The insufficient information available to investors, the inadequate oversight of how shares were promoted and sold. These regulatory changes did not immediately restore the share markets to their previous levels. Prices in the early and middle 1930s remained far below the peaks of 1929, but they changed the environment in which the markets operated, requiring more transparency and more accountability, and those changes became permanent features of the financial landscape. The Public Works Administration, established in 1933, funded the construction of large-scale infrastructure projects: dams, bridges, federal buildings, highways, port facilities. The projects were planned and administered by engineers and project managers and a large supporting staff of procurement officers and accountants and supervisors. They took time to get started, because large construction projects require planning before they require labour, and the planning process for a dam or a major highway is not quick. The Civil Works Administration, also established in 1933 and running through the winter of 1933 and 1934, was designed for faster deployment. It put people to work on smaller scale projects, repairing roads, improving public facilities, doing the kind of maintenance and improvement work that communities needed, but had been deferring for lack of funds. It employed a large number of people in a relatively short period of time, moving quickly enough that its effects were felt within months rather than years. The concept underlying all of these programs, that government spending could replace, at least in part, the private spending that had contracted, was not universally accepted at the time. There were economists and policymakers who believed that government spending of this kind would crowd out private investment, that the money the government was spending was money that would otherwise have been available for private activity, and that the net effect would therefore be smaller than it appeared. There were others who believed that in conditions of deep contraction, when private investment had declined sharply and was not recovering on its own, government spending provided a form of demand that the private sector was not providing, and that this additional demand was genuinely additive rather than merely substitutive. What is observable, without taking a position in those debates, is that the programs were implemented, that they employed a large number of people, that the wages from those jobs entered the economy, and that the economy, over the course of the middle and later 1930s, moved in a generally improving direction from the depths of 1932 and 1933. The improvement was uneven and incomplete. There were setbacks, including a significant contraction in 1937 and 1938 when some of the support programs were reduced too quickly. But the general direction changed. On the ordinary street, the changes arrive gradually, in the way that all changes arrive in the ordinary texture of daily life, not as announcements or turning points, but as small shifts in the quality of activity, noticed only when compared to what preceded them. The grocer has restocked a few of the items he removed from his shelves during the worst of the contraction, The orders he places with the distributor are a little larger than they were 6 months ago. Not as large as they were in 1928, but moving in the right direction. He notes this in his ledger with the same careful arithmetic he has always applied, and the number at the bottom of the monthly column is, for the first time in a while, slightly better than the month before. The factory is still running one shift, but the contract for next year is larger than this year's. Not as large as the contracts of the late 1920s, but larger. The factory owner has begun, cautiously, to think about whether he might hire back 1 or 2 of the workers he let go. He is not ready to commit to that yet, but he is thinking about it, which is itself a change from 6 months ago, when he was not thinking about it at all. The street is still quieter than it was before the contraction. It will be quieter for some time yet. The recovery, such as it is, moves at the pace of large things, slowly, and with pauses, and without any single moment that announces itself as the moment when things turned. But the direction, in the middle years of the 1930s, has begun to shift. And the shift, however gradual, is real. Recovery, when it comes to a large economic system, does not announce itself. It does not arrive on a particular morning with some change in the quality of the light, or some shift in the sound of the street, or some visible sign that things are different from how they were the day before. It arrives the way most large changes arrive in the texture of ordinary life, gradually and unevenly, and in ways that are only recognizable as recovery, when enough of them have accumulated to produce a pattern that can be seen. The pattern, in the middle years of the 1930s, is one of slow and partial improvement. Slow because the conditions that produced the contraction did not resolve quickly, and the institutions and behaviours and expectations that had adjusted downward during the difficult years did not readjust upward at a faster pace than they had adjusted down. Partial, because the improvement did not reach every part of the economy at the same time or to the same degree, and because the economy at the end of the decade had not returned to where it was at the peak of the late 1920s, and would not return there within the decade. But the direction had changed, and in the long, slow life of a large economic system, the direction matters enormously. Let us return to the street. The grocer is still there. He has been there for nearly 20 years now, and the experience of the contraction has not closed his doors, though there were a few months in 1932 and 1933 when the arithmetic in his ledger was close enough to the edge that he thought carefully about what he would do if the edge were crossed. The edge was not crossed. He is still there, still unlocking the door in the morning, still adding up the columns in the evening. The columns have been improving. Not every month. There are still months that are worse than the month before, and the improvement is not linear or guaranteed. But over the course of 1934 and 1935, the general tendency of the numbers at the bottom of his monthly pages has been upward. He has restored most of the items he removed from his shelves during the worst of it. He has rehired one part-time employee. He has resumed the standing order from the distributor at something close to its pre-contraction level, though not quite at it. These are not large changes. They are the small and incremental changes of a business cautiously rebuilding its normal operations, one careful decision at a time. But they are changes in the right direction, and the accumulation of right direction changes over enough months adds up to something that begins to feel like recovery from the inside of it. The factory is still running one shift. This is the part of the street story that has been slowest to change. The automobile manufacturer that provides the factory's contract has been increasing its orders gradually, but the recovery in automobile production has been uneven. Good quarters followed by cautious ones, expansion followed by hesitation. The factory owner is not yet running 2 shifts. He does not know when he will. But the contract for the current year is larger than the contract for the year before, and the contract for the year before was larger than the one before that. The trajectory, measured not month by month but year by year, is upward. He has rehired 3 workers, 3 of the people who had been coming through the factory door every morning and then were not. They are coming through the door again. They are running the machines. They are packing the crates. Their wages are moving through the neighborhood in the ordinary way of wages, spent at the grocer, deposited at the bank, paid as rent, used for the small purchases of daily life. 3 workers is not the full workforce that was let go, but it is 3 more than were employed here last year and the year before that. Recovery is, among other things, a counting exercise, the slow accumulation of people returning to paid employment, 1 and then 2 and then 3, until the number of people without work is smaller than it was, and then smaller still. The bank, reorganized and under new management, is functioning again in something closer to its ordinary mode. The loan portfolio that was troubled through the worst years has been worked through. Some loans renegotiated, some written off, some eventually repaid in full. The new management has been cautious about new lending, more cautious than the previous management had been in the late 1920s. But loans are being made. Businesses that present reasonable cases for credit are finding it available. The conversations that had gone quiet during the period of maximum caution are happening again. The deposit insurance that came with the banking reforms has changed the atmosphere in the bank in a way that is difficult to quantify but real. Depositors who come in to make transactions have a different relationship to the institution than they had in 1931 and 1932, when the possibility of losing one's deposits was a real and present concern. That concern has not entirely disappeared. People remember what happened, and the memory shapes their behavior in ways that persist for years. But the acute anxiety of that period, the sense that the money might simply not be there, has receded. The deposits are insured, the guarantee is in place, the background worry is lower. The brokerage office has reopened with a reduced but functioning staff. The board on the wall still shows prices, and the prices it shows are higher than they were at the bottom of 1932 and 1933, though they are still far below the peaks of 1929. The new regulatory environment, the disclosure requirements, the oversight of the Securities and Exchange Commission, has changed how the office operates in certain procedural ways. There is more paperwork. There are more forms. The standards for what must be disclosed to clients about the investments they are being offered are more specific than they were before. These changes have added administrative work to the business of the office, and the men at the desks have adapted to that work in the way that people in regulated industries adapt to new requirements. by incorporating them into their routines until the requirements become as ordinary as everything else. The streetcar is running its full schedule again. The branch line that had been suspended during the worst years of the contraction has been restored. The ridership is higher than it was at the bottom, though still somewhat below the levels of the late 1920s. The company that operates the streetcar has made its own cautious return to normal operations, restoring what was cut away when the cuts became necessary and building back toward the full service it once provided. The employment office on the main street has shorter lines than it did 3 years ago. The men who had been adding their names to the lists and waiting for placements that did not come have been finding gradually that placements are more available. Not for everyone, and not quickly, and the placements that are available do not always match the work that the people seeking them had previously done. A man who had worked in a factory that has not fully recovered may find work in a different kind of job, at wages that are lower than what he earned before. The adjustment is real, and it is not without cost. But the line is shorter, and the placements are happening, and the directional change from the worst years is clear. The city government's revenues are recovering alongside the economic activity that generates them. The property taxes that were difficult to collect during the years when property values had declined and owners were under pressure are more consistently arriving. The various fees and levies that track general commercial activity are higher than they were at the bottom. The budget that had been under severe pressure is still constrained, but the severity of the constraint has eased. Some of the services that had been reduced have been restored. Some of the projects that had been deferred have been started. The new federal programs, the public works employment, the relief payments, the various agricultural and business support programs are present in the life of the city and its surrounding region in ways that were not present before the contraction. There are workers employed on a road project at the edge of the city who would not otherwise be employed. There are farmers in the surrounding counties receiving support payments that have helped stabilize their incomes during years when market prices alone would not have been sufficient. There is a new post office building under construction, funded by federal money, employing local construction workers, generating local wages. These additions to the economic activity of the city are not enormous in any individual case, but they are real, and they are consistent, and their presence in the system contributes to the gradual building of activity that is the texture of this recovery. What recovery feels like from the inside of the ordinary street is not triumph. It does not feel like a return to something. It feels more like the slow resumption of forward motion after a period of stillness. The cautious re-engagement with plans and possibilities that had been set aside. The tentative rebuilding of expectations about the future that had contracted along with everything else during the difficult years. The factory owner thinks about the second shift again, for the first time in several years. He does not start it yet, but he thinks about it. He mentions it to his wife one evening, describing it as something that might be possible in the next year or two, if the contracts continue to improve. The mention of it is itself a small act of forward-looking, a small recovery of the orientation toward the future that had been difficult to sustain when the future had seemed so uncertain. The grocer's son, who's now old enough to take a real role in the business, has been talking with his father about adding a small prepared food section. It would require some additional equipment and a change in the store's layout. His father is listening to the idea with more openness than he would have shown 2 years ago. The conversation continues over several evenings in the back of the store after closing. It has not resulted in a decision yet, but it is happening, which means that the store is in a small way thinking about its future again, rather than only managing its present. The bank manager, the new one who came with the reorganization, has approved 3 new business loans in the past quarter. Each one was carefully evaluated. Each one presented a reasonable case. The borrowers are a small contractor, a woman who is opening a laundry, and the owner of a hardware store in a neighborhood that lost its previous hardware store during the contraction and has been without one since. 3 loans, 3 businesses, 3 sets of wages that will flow into the neighborhood economy when the businesses are operating. The arithmetic of recovery is made of exactly these small and individual transactions. The children who were born in the early years of the contraction are old enough now to be in school. They are learning to read and to add and subtract in classrooms that are part of the same city that has been changing around them since before they were conscious of it. They do not know the street as it was in 1928. They know it only as it is, which to them is simply the ordinary street, the only street they have known, with its shops and its streetcar and its bank and its factory, a few blocks away. The contraction and the recovery are not part of their experience as experiences. They are simply the condition of the world they have grown up in. This is how large economic events eventually become history rather than present circumstance. The people who lived through the worst of it carry it with them. In the habits of saving they maintain long after the pressure to save so carefully has passed. In the caution about borrowing that persists beyond the period when caution was necessary. In the particular attentiveness to small financial details that comes from having learned, in the most direct way, that small financial details can matter very much. The memory of the difficult years shapes behavior for decades, in ways that are not always visible, but are real. The institutions that were created during the response to the contraction, the deposit insurance, the securities regulation, the oversight agencies, the programs that provide a floor of support beneath the economy's ordinary fluctuations, become part of the permanent landscape of economic life. They were built in response to specific conditions, to address specific failures that the contraction had revealed. Over time, they become so much a part of the ordinary background of economic activity that it is difficult to remember or to imagine a time when they were not there. The street does not remember when they were not there because the street does not have memory in the way that people do. It simply continues. The buildings stand, the shops open and close, the deliveries arrive, the wages are paid and spent, the bank processes its transactions, the streetcar runs on its tracks. By the end of the 1930s, the ordinary street is quieter than it was in 1928, and busier than it was in 1932. It has been through a decade that required adjustments it did not anticipate, and it has come through that decade changed in ways that are not fully visible from the surface of it, but are present in every transaction, every loan, every deposit, every careful decision made by a person who learned something from the years that passed. The contraction was real, the adjustment was real, the recovery was real. And beneath all of it, beneath the falling prices and the failing banks and the empty storefronts and the lengthening lines and the slow, procedural work of rebuilding, the ordinary activity of ordinary people buying and selling and working and saving continued, in the patient and unremarkable way that it always continues, because there is always something that needs to be done, and someone who will do it. The delivery truck will come tomorrow morning. The sign will be flipped from closed to open. The streetcar bell will ring once at the stop on the corner, and then once more when it moves away. The street goes on, the economy goes on, slowly and without drama and at the pace of large things that do not hurry, which is, in the end, the only pace they have ever known. This has been the Drowsy Economist. Long cycles, slow adjustments, the patient unfolding of economic history. If you found value in this gentle exploration, whether for understanding or for sleep, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps others find this quiet corner of the internet. And if there are other topics in economics or finance you would like explored in this format, the comments are always open. Somewhere on an ordinary street in an ordinary city, a shop is opening for the morning. The sign is being flipped. The lights are coming on inside. The ordinary business of another day is beginning, as it always does, without announcement and without ceremony, simply because it is morning, and morning is when ordinary business begins. Thank you for spending this time here. Whether you are still with me or have long since drifted off, I hope you found the rest you came for. Sweet dreams and good night.